In the spring of 1877, a pile of stacked stones sat on a rise above the Wallowa Valley in what is now northeastern Oregon, marking the grave of an old man named Tuakakis. Settlers called him Old Chief Joseph. 6 years earlier, blind and dying, he had told his son to never sell the bones of his father and his mother, and to remember that this valley, with its camas prairies and its salmon runs up the Grande Ronde, had never been sold by anyone with the standing to sell it. That son, born Hinmatóowyalahtqit and known to the whites as young Joseph, had spent the years since trying to keep that promise against a government that had already decided otherwise. The Nez Perce had a longer relationship with the United States than almost any tribe west of the Mississippi, one that began well before either side had reason for grievance. When Lewis and Clark's expedition stumbled starving out of the Bitterroot Mountains in the autumn of 1805, it was Nez Perce hospitality that fed them, and Nez Perce goodwill that kept their horses safe through the following winter. That relationship held for 2 generations, through missionaries, through fur traders, through the first waves of Oregon Trail settlers who passed the tribe's land without incident. Tuakakis himself was baptized by the missionary Henry Spalding in the 1830s and raised his sons within the mission's teaching, a fact that made his later break with Washington all the more pointed, since it was not the resistance of a stranger to American promises, but the disillusionment of a man who had once believed them. The break began with gold. In 1860, prospectors found color near what became Pierce, Idaho, on land the 1855 treaty had guaranteed to the Nez Perce outright, and within 3 years thousands of miners had moved onto that land with no legal standing and no intention of leaving. Rather than remove the miners, the federal government proposed removing the treaty line instead. The result, negotiated in 1863, cut the reservation by roughly 90%, from several million acres down to a fraction of that, keeping only the ground immediately around the Lapwai mission. Chiefs whose bands already lived inside that smaller boundary signed it. Chiefs whose bands lived outside it, including Old Joseph, Whitebird, Looking Glass, and Toohoolhoolzote, refused, arguing that no signature from one band could sell land belonging to another. The Nez Perce themselves came to call it the Thief Treaty. From that year forward, there were, in practical terms, 2 Nez Perce nations under one name: the treaty bands, increasingly Christian and increasingly settled into the reservation's boundaries, and the non-treaty bands, many of them followers of a faith called Washani, the dreamer religion, preached by a prophet named Smohalla, who taught that farming the earth was an offense against it, since no person had ever owned the ground to begin with, and no person had the standing to sign it away. Agency officials distrusted the dreamer faith openly, blaming it in their own written reports for the non-treaty bands' refusal to settle down and take up plows, and that distrust hardened Washington's position in the years leading up to 1877, as much as any dispute over acreage did. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. For 14 years after his father's death, young Joseph held the Wallowa band to that same refusal, without a single act of violence, arguing his case year after year to whichever agents and inspectors Washington sent through. More than one of those inspectors filed reports recommending the valley be left to the Nez Perce, since so few white families had settled it, and so much of it was unsuited to farming. Local political pressure from Oregon settlers who wanted the range for cattle outweighed those recommendations every time. It held until 1877, when General Oliver Otis Howard called the non-treaty chiefs to a final council at Lapwai and gave them 30 days to bring their people, their horses, and their herds onto the reduced reservation or be moved there by force. Toohoolhoolzote argued back hardest of anyone at that council and spent 5 of its days locked in a guardhouse for the offense of refusing to yield the point. Joseph, by his own later account, judged that resistance meant a war his people could not win, and turned instead to the practical work of fording the Snake River in full flood season with thousands of cattle and horses, trying to make a deadline that had never accounted for how much livestock a mountain people actually owned. They very nearly made it. In the last days before the deadline, a young man named Wallowa, whose father had been killed years earlier by a settler named Larry Ott, with no charges ever filed against him, rode out with 2 companions and killed 4 white men along the Salmon River, avenging that death and another alongside it. Word reached the non-treaty camp that war parties were already in motion before the chiefs had any chance to stop them, and men who had spent months arguing for patience now found themselves in a war none of them had chosen and none of them could undo. On the 17th of June, a detachment of cavalry under Captain David Perry rode into Whitebird Canyon to put down what Howard's command still assumed was a minor disturbance, sending a small party forward under a truce flag that one of Perry's own bugle calls promptly undercut. Whitebird and Ollokot's warriors, outnumbered but far better positioned on the surrounding ridges, killed 34 soldiers that morning and lost none of their own. It was the first battle of the war, and for the army, the worst single defeat of it. What followed was not one campaign, but a retreat that covered more ground than almost any military pursuit in American history before it. Roughly 1,100 miles across 4 future states, undertaken by a column of some 700 people, fewer than 200 of them men of fighting age, moving the entire way with their families, their elders, and thousands of head of horses. No single chief commanded that retreat, whatever the newspapers of the day and the histories written after them chose to print. Decisions were made collectively by a council that included Lookingglass, Whitebird, Toohoolhoolzote, Ollokot, and Joseph, among others, with field leadership shifting to whichever chief's judgment the group trusted most for a given stretch of ground. Joseph's own responsibility, by his account, and by the accounts of those who fought beside him, fell mainly to guarding the camp itself, the old people, the children, and the herds, work that kept him constantly near the column's most vulnerable members, and far more often than not out of the fighting altogether. The press back east needed a single face for the story regardless, and his happened to be the one they had already learned to print. At the Clearwater in July, a 2-day engagement failed to break either side, but persuaded the Council of Chiefs that further fighting on Idaho ground brought them nothing but more dead. They chose instead to cross the Bitterroots by the Lolo Trail into Montana, hoping to find safe passage among the Crow, or failing that, sanctuary across the border in Canada, where Sitting Bull's Lakota had already fled the previous year after the fighting on the northern plains. The trail itself nearly finished what the army had not. It ran through dense timber and standing deadfall for well over 100 miles, climbing and dropping across ridgelines with almost no forage for the horses, and by the time the column reached the Bitterroot Valley on the other side, both people and animals were living on what little game the hunters could find along the way. A hastily assembled barricade of Montana volunteers tried to block the Lolo Pass exit and negotiated instead of fighting, a standoff remembered locally ever since as Fort Fizzle for how little resistance it actually offered. The worst single loss of the entire war came at the Big Hole, in southwestern Montana, on the 9th of August. Colonel John Gibbon's troops found the non-treaty camp asleep before first light and opened fire directly into the lodges rather than announcing themselves, a decision that meant the fighting's first casualties were not warriors, but women, children, and the old people sleeping nearest the tipi doors. Somewhere between 60 and 90, Nez Perce died in the opening minutes and the hours that followed. 2 respected warriors, Rainbow and 5 Wounds, were among the men killed defending the camp's retreat. The survivors regrouped fast enough to pin Gibbon's soldiers behind a barricade of fallen timber for the rest of the day, buying time for the wounded to be moved out, but the column that left the Big Hole was not the column that had entered it 2 days before. Some of the chiefs who had argued longest for a peaceful crossing through Montana, trusting local settlers to let them pass unmolested, never trusted that argument again, and Lookingglass, whose camp security had failed to spot Gibbon's approach, lost much of the authority he had carried into the campaign. 11 days later, at Camas Meadows, a night raid on Howard's pack train made off with roughly 200 mules, a strike aimed less at bloodshed than at buying distance, since a pursuing army on foot only moves as fast as its supplies allow. For a while it worked. At Canyon Creek in mid-September, a running fight with cavalry under Samuel Sturgis, the same officer whose own regiment had lost George Custer at the Little Bighorn the year before, ended with the column escaping largely intact into the Badlands beyond. Near Cow Island on the Missouri River, a smaller raiding party helped itself to a military supply depot, taking food and ammunition the fleeing column badly needed and burning the rest before soldiers could reclaim it. By late September, the non-treaty bands were close enough to the Canadian border that some among them believed the worst of the danger had passed, and the pace of the march slowed to let 5 months of exhausted survivors rest before the final push north. Whether that slowing was simple human exhaustion or a miscalculation about how far behind their pursuers actually were, it gave Colonel Nelson Miles the days he needed to close the gap. On the 30th of September, Miles's column caught the camp in the Bear Paw Mountains, some 40 miles short of the border, and opened the siege that would end the war. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Miles opened with a mounted charge meant to overrun the camp outright before it could dig in, and it failed badly enough that his own after-action reports admitted heavy losses among the officers who led it. Several companies of cavalry and mounted infantry pinned down and shredded within the first half hour by warriors firing from cover at close range. What followed instead was 5 days of siege in the first hard cold of early October. The people dug into pits, scraped from half-frozen ground, with knives and cooking implements, forbidden by their own leaders from lighting fires that would give away their position to the mountain howitzer Miles brought up, and turned on the camp within the first 2 days. Toohoolhoolzote was killed in the opening assault. Ollokot, Joseph's younger brother and one of the war's most capable field commanders, was killed that same day, alongside Lean Elk, who had guided the column through most of its Montana route after Looking Glass lost the chief's confidence at the Big Hole. On the night of the 6th day, Whitebird led roughly 200 people out through gaps in the siege line under cover of darkness and reached Sitting Bull's camp in Canada within the week, the only substantial group of the original column to reach the exact destination all of them had set out for 5 months earlier. Joseph did not go with them. His own family, along with the wounded, the very old, and those too weak to survive a nighttime crossing on foot in October snow, could not make that run, and by every account he gave afterward, he judged that staying with them mattered more than reaching the border himself. On the 5th of October 1877, Joseph surrendered to Miles and Howard, handing over his rifle in a gesture both officers later described in their own reports, though not identically. What he said in that moment survives only through the account of Howard's aide, Lieutenant Charles Erskine Scott Wood, who wrote it down afterward, and whose exact phrasing historians have argued over ever since no other witness recorded it independently, and Wood's own literary ambitions were well known among the officers who served with him. By that account, Joseph said his chiefs were dead, his people were cold and had no blankets, and that from where the sun now stood, he would fight no more forever. Whatever the precise words were, the surrender itself is not in dispute, and neither is what both Miles and Howard promised him in exchange for it, standing in that frozen camp with the fighting finally over, that the surrendering bands would be held safely through the winter and return to their homes in Idaho the following spring. That promise was not theirs to keep. General William Tecumseh Sherman, who outranked both men and had no patience for resettling a band that had just humiliated the army across 4 territories, overruled it from Washington before winter had even set in. Instead of Idaho, the surviving non-treaty Nez Perce were shipped first to Fort Abraham Lincoln in Dakota Territory, then to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where they were held through a summer on low bottomland along the Missouri River, land so poorly chosen for the purpose that malaria killed dozens of people who had survived 5 months of running battles without losing a single major engagement to the army itself. From Leavenworth they were moved again to Indian Territory in what is now Oklahoma, first to the Quapaw Agency and then to a tract near the Ponca Agency that the Nez Perce themselves named Ekish Pa, the hot place. More than 100 of them, most of them children, died there over the following years of illnesses their bodies carried no resistance to, in a climate nothing like the cool plateau country hundreds of miles to the northwest that they still called home. The exile lasted 8 years in total, long enough that an entire generation of Nez Perce children grew up never having seen the valleys their parents still described to them, and long enough that when the survivors were finally counted for the trip home in 1885, barely half of the roughly 430 who had gone into exile remained alive to make it. Miles himself never fully let the broken promise go. He raised the question with his own superiors more than once in the years after 1877, arguing that an officer's word given in the field ought to count for something, even when generals in Washington disagreed, though rank alone was never enough to reverse Sherman's decision. Joseph did not stop arguing his own case either, and he did not confine that argument to reservation agents. In 1879, he traveled to Washington at his own request, met President Rutherford B. Hayes in person, and addressed a room of federal officials and newspaper reporters directly through an interpreter, a speech later adapted into an essay published under his name in the North American Review titled An Indian's View of Indian Affairs, in which he wrote that good words did not last long unless they amounted to good deeds. He returned east more than once in the years that followed, met with President William McKinley in 1897, and toured cities where his name had become known through newspaper coverage of the war, always circling back to the same request, stated plainly and without theatrics, to be allowed to take his people home to Wallowa. In 1885, Washington finally agreed to let the survivors return west, though not as one people and not to one place. Those willing to accept Christian conversion and individual land allotments were sent to the Lapwai Reservation in Idaho, rejoining the treaty bands whose choices back in 1863 had split the Nez Perce apart in the first place. Joseph and those who would not convert were sent instead to the Colville Reservation in Washington state, to a place called Nespelem, hundreds of miles from Wallowa and from the relatives who had gone to Lapwai instead. He visited the Wallowa Valley more than once in the years that followed, meeting directly with the white ranchers who now held the land his father was buried in, and came away each time with nothing more than polite refusals. Local opposition to any Nez Perce return never softened enough for the federal government to force the issue, whatever sympathy individual officials expressed in private. By multiple contemporary newspaper accounts, Joseph made one last visit to Wallowa in 1900, 4 years before his death, and stood alone for a long while at his father's grave on the rise above the valley. The reporters traveling with him that day described him weeping, an image that ran in papers across the country and did more to fix his name in the public memory than almost anything he had said in Washington. He left again without the answer he had come for. The ranchers who held the valley by then had built fences and irrigation ditches across ground his father had once ridden freely, and no one in Washington was willing to unwind 2 decades of settlement to satisfy the request of a single old man, however famous his name had become. Joseph died at Nespelem in 1904. The agency physician who examined him afterward recorded the cause of death, in his own written words, as a broken heart. He was buried there, not beside his father in the valley he had spent his entire adult life trying to hold on to, but in a small cemetery on a reservation that had never been his home, under a stone monument raised the following year by admirers who had followed his case in the newspapers but had not been in Washington to help him keep the promise he made his father when it still mattered. The grave above Wallowa that his father made him swear to protect still sits there today, and the son who kept that oath for as long as keeping it was possible lies 400 miles away, in ground he was given in place of the ground he spent 30 years asking for. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.